Welcome to our online version of confirmation class, even more online than it normally is, because this week Phil is going to be sharing a recorded session discussing the promised land. So last week we finished off our conversation of Joshua and Caleb and those who were disobedient in the wilderness. And now we shift our focus to the promised land and God fulfilling his promise of bringing his people there. So Phil, take it away.
Thanks. So I want to talk briefly about Joshua, the promised land, the choices that go on, and just sort of give you an overview, because I think this is an important point that even though we're not able to cover it during our regular sessions and discuss it, I think there are topics here that we can discuss, and there are things that I wanted to point out to you if your son or daughter's in the confirmation class, that they are meeting and they will be discussing. So let me give you a quick overview of the book of Joshua. I would point out, if you're familiar with the Bible Project, the Bible Project has video overviews of every book. They are 6, 7, 8 minutes long. They're really, really good. And I just recommend the one on, I recommend all of them. The one on Joshua is exceptionally good. And so you can go to the Bible Project, Google them, download their app, and watch the videos, but they're really good. And I just recommended. The book of Joshua is bookended by two very familiar passages, places that people would say, well, here are life verses for us. In chapter 1, the beginning of chapter 1, right at the beginning, God is commissioning Joshua to be the leader of the Israelites and to take the conquest of the promised land. And he tells them at the beginning of chapter 1 to be strong and courageous. And he tells them 3 times in those verses. Sometimes it's very strong, but be strong and courageous. So that's the front end of it. Be strong and courageous. At the end of the book, in chapter 24, in the very last part, Joshua is addressing the people of Israel, and he's challenging them about how they're going to live. And he says, another familiar passage, choose this day whom you will serve. I left out a little bit. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So at the front end, you have be strong and courageous, and the back end, you have choose this day. Those make the bookends for the book of Joshua. It's about the choices that they're going to make. Just a few thoughts on questions that arise from studying this book. First off, what is the significance of the promised land? What does it mean for Israel? What does it mean for us? And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think for us as American Christians, the promised land, it's easy to lose some track of what it's important for. But for God's people, Israel, it is a geographical location. It is bounded by certain rivers. There are mountains, there are streams, there are hills. And it's not an abstract place. It is a physical location. And the action, so to speak, of the books of the Bible occur primarily within these physical locations. They name specific villages. They talk about streams they cross over. They name hills and mountains. They say the hills will clap their hands. So it is a geographical location, and it's important to them. But more than that, or in addition to that, it is a relationship with God. The promised land is where they are to have. God says, "I will be your God, and you will be my people." The relationship is part of the promised land. Their relationship with God, where he is their God, and that's going to define their relationships with one another and with their adversaries. So it isn't only the geography that matters, the countryside, the hills, and so on. It is the relationship. For us in the church, it describes the promised land, describes our relationship with God. It's a picture of our relationship with God. You can take this in many different ways, and different theological traditions interpret it different ways. But no matter how you think of it, the promised land is a picture of our relationship with God. The book of Hebrews refers to it as a rest. And by using it as a rest, the rest refers to harmony with God. And because other people are in harmony with God, under God's authority, we have harmony with one another. The rest is a harmony with God. The rest is a relationship with God that is characterized by security, love, confidence, hope, faith, trust, and so on. So it is our relationship with God in this life. The promised land pictures our relationship with God in this life. It's not a picture of heaven. It's not heaven. It may depict something of heaven, don't know, but it's not heaven. So that when we use phrases or sing spiritual songs, spirituals about crossing over Jordan and going into the promised land as if we're going to heaven, as something that happens when we die, that's not the picture. It's not something we have only in the future. It's a relationship we have with God that we're to strive for and enjoy now, even as our enemies are all around us. So that's the first part of the promised land we want to talk about. The second topic is a difficult one. The book of Joshua is brutally violent. God tells them in different times they have to eradicate their enemies. They have to eliminate there are people living in this land. Those people are going to lead Israel to sin. God tells them they have to be uncompromising and brutal with them. It is difficult to read. It is difficult for me to look at and say, well, I understand this. I understand it at a doctrinal level, sort of. I don't think I understand it at a more visceral level of what it really means. But what God is saying, you cannot adopt the practices of those people living in the land. You cannot be like them. You cannot go back into spiritual slavery. The relationship that they have with God is so valuable and so important that they have to be uncompromising and even brutal in getting rid of what's there. It is hard to read. But I would say this about it. It's not a lesson for us in the long term in some ways. It was a unique time and a unique experience in the history of God's people. It's not the way we're supposed to deal with our enemies. And even among those who lived in the land, if they lived in the land and repented and worshiped God, they were spared. Rahab, Ruth, and on. There were many of them who repented, lived in the land, and were spared. So God was not telling them to eradicate every individual because there were people who would repent and worship God. Where Jesus told us to love our enemies. He didn't tell us to go out and eradicate our enemies. He didn't tell us to eliminate our enemies. He said to love our enemies, pray for them. So this was a unique time when they come into the promised land that they were supposed to do this. One of the more helpful passages on this is a relatively short set of verses in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus and his disciples are passing through Samaria, and they stop in a village, and the village, opposes them. And his disciples, James and John, want Jesus to bring down fire and destroy those people who oppose him. They wanted him to do essentially a promised land response, to bring down fire, destroy these enemies. But Jesus doesn't do it. And not only that, he rebukes James and John for requesting it, not for the Samaritans. So again, it's not saying that we're supposed to eradicate our enemies. We're supposed to eliminate those people. We're supposed to have that kind of violence and brutality towards others. But where we are supposed to have an uncompromising and even brutal response is to get rid of the sin in ourselves. Romans puts it this way: put to death the misdeeds of the body. And again, Paul will talk about putting to death, putting to death, putting to death. So what was in the promised land was eliminating the sin, because the people who represented the sin and were going to cause Israel to sin what we're told by with the coming of the Holy Spirit is that we're to put to death the sins, not the people, but the sins are to be put to death. I say this, I'm pretty sure it's doctrinally accurate. I would also say the book of Joshua is violent and hard to understand at times, hard to understand the violence at times. The book itself breaks into 3 sections, and I think it's helpful to look at these 3 sections, reminding ourselves that they're talking about, it's picturing our life with God, our relationship with God. The first chapters is they enter the land by trusting God in chapter 3. If you read it, you'll see that he provides a path through the Jordan River, and the Ark of the Covenant goes before them, and the waters part, and the people pass over, and there's no battles, there's no troubles, there's no problems. Entering the promised land, like entering into our relationship with God, doesn't require battles. It requires trust. They don't have to fight enemies to do this. They have to trust God, and he provides the path for them. But once they get into the land, it changes. Chapters 6 through 12, they conquer the land through repeated battles, some of them victories, some of them defeats, one after another after another. It's hard to keep track of them. In chapter 12, it lists all the kings who were defeated, and it's a fairly long list. In fact, in chapter 4, as they're getting ready, it's the first time it talks about the people of Israel being ready for battle. Until this time, they were not asked to fight their enemies. It's only when they get into the promised land. So for us, we can enter the relationship with God through trusting him. But once we become believers and followers of God, and once we have that relationship, there are going to be repeated battles, victories, defeats. But we should expect that relationship will require us to battle against sin. Then the last part of the book is that they get to live in the land. They never fully conquer the land, which is important. They never drive out their enemies, which will turn out to be really important. Yet God still allows them to enjoy some of the benefits of the land. So even though they're not living perfectly the way that would have been desired, they're not living in this perfect relationship with God and with each other and with their adversaries. Their adversaries aren't eliminated. God's still allowing them to enjoy some of the benefits. But eventually, their failure to complete the conquest, to drive out the sin that's there, will be the source of that'll be how they'll end up being removed from the land. So that's the sections of the book. And I think it really depicts parts of our lives that we can enter into a relationship with God, say a conversion type experience, by trusting him. But the life as a Christian is going to require battles and struggles, victories, defeats. Jesus said to his disciples, in this world you will have troubles, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And we'll get to enjoy some of the benefits of that life, even though we're still in the process of driving out our enemies and driving out sin. The last part that I want to talk about is an episode in chapter 5. 3 verses, very important. At the end of chapter 5, Joshua, they're in the land, they're camped in the land, and Joshua is preparing to fight the first battle against the great city of Jericho. He's out in the evening, and the commander of the Lord's army appears to Joshua. An angel, a pre-incarnate Christ, the commander of the Lord's army, probably an angel. Joshua sees him and he says to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And the commander of the Lord's army says, in most of our translations, no. Or maybe you want to look at it and says, well, neither. I'm not for you and I'm not for your adversaries. But another way to think about it is he's saying, you're asking the wrong question. It's not a question of, am I going to be on your side or on your adversary's side? The question is, whose side are you going to be on? That we don't invite or ask God to be on our side. We don't say, God, come be on my side for this battle. We don't get to say, God will fight this battle for us. What we want to ask ourselves is, have we put ourselves on God's side? It's a song I learned in Sunday school as a child. Who is on the Lord's side? It comes from this passage that we can't try to recruit God to our side in any battle or any dispute. We have to say, God, I'm on your side. Show me how to go forward. So that's very quickly the lesson from the book of Joshua. I encourage you to look at the video, read the book yourself, certainly look at the video from the Bible Project. And it's really quite a book. There are many episodes in it that would bear further conversation. We don't have time to do them this time around. All right, thanks a lot.